Thank you very much. So I'm Adrian Taylor. I work for a company called Scrutiny. We are a proud partner of SASIG, but what we do, I won't bore you with at any length. We run managed security services and we operate secure environments for other people effectively. And I'm joined by my colleague in the industry, David Levine, who is an expert in the field of privilege management, so identity and privilege management. So we're very lucky to, or you're very lucky, in fact, that he's going to be doing most of the talking. And I will hand over to him in a moment to give us some insights into how that the approaches are evolving into dealing with privilege. If we can have the next one, that'd be great. So it's interesting. I've been doing. I've been working in IT, I've been working in security and networking for a very long time, but prior to that, I was a trainee, started my life as a trainee mainframe operator back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. The model really of a user ID which has certain privileges to do certain things, whether they're administrative or normal, hasn't really changed since all that time, right? I mean, I can remember administering a thing called RACF, which is how we did what wasn't even called identity management back then, right? It was just user management in order to create new users and permit them to do certain things. And you know, moving through the Windows and networking and security environments as my career progressed and the hardware and software changed for many years, the way we did that and the way that user IDs and identity was manipulated and created and operated was pretty much the same. And you know, the age-old problem of, especially in busy big companies where somebody joins an organization, they work in a team and therefore they get assigned a user ID with the groups associated with that team and therefore the permissions with that team by default is still, you know, I come across that still as common practice, and for some reasons, for some good reasons, that has to be the case. But you know, not everybody needs the same level of privilege just because they happen to be doing the same job, and it's a problem which has stemmed throughout my it's been a theme throughout my career, is how do you control over privilege, and how do you make sure privileges still apply. You know, how do you make privileges only apply for the time that you need somebody to do the job, particularly if it's administrative, that particular function of that job, and then make sure it's taken away afterwards. It's actually quite difficult to do, and it's one of those topics which, although on the surface looks, with many apologies to David, on the surface looks like it could be, you know, reasonably dull. It's one of those things when you start picking it apart. Identity management, particularly privilege identity management, is an incredibly powerful tool in our armory to defend modern infrastructures and applications against security attacks. And that's what this is all about, really, right? It's defending ourselves. And it's certainly crucial with this particular element, with identity, because threat actors really understand it, right? They understand how user IDs are configured and assigned to groups. They understand that they're quite often overprivileged. They understand that they can escalate privilege in ways that that it was never intended it was possible to do with those credentials. They understand about hard-coded credentials. You know, they understand about standing privilege. And if you think of any successful ransomware attack, certainly in the last, you know, five years, there has been either a compromise of credential, compromise of privilege, sometimes based on leaked credentials, or there's been an escalation of privilege based on a weakness of the operating system or the configuration of those credentials. And the problem is that if the malware is using credentials to do things which the credentials are allowed to do, one of your avenues for detecting and stopping it is gone. So it's incredibly important. I think our applications and data are not all in one place, in a data center under your feet like they used to be. The places we access those applications and data from are not fixed to a desk anymore, and users similarly are mobile between devices. So that identity really has become an entity which needs to go with them and to reflect the privilege they need to do their job at the time they need to do their job. And it's heavily embedded with the zero trust security architecture model. I will stop rabbiting on and I will hand over to David, who, as I say, is an expert in the field and is going to tell us a little bit more about how the problem can be approached. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and talking about what you've seen in your career. So although you said that it is boring,
sorry.
Most
I didn't think you were boring.
Yeah, but most of the breaches, as you know, do happen, as you mentioned, because of that privilege escalation and standing privileges. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what those standing privileges are, why it's important, and kind of the zero trust model and how to get there. Right. So I think the first place to start is, what is least privilege, as you mentioned? And least privilege is basically the accounts that you should be operating at about 90 to 100% of the time. Right. Those are those non-privileged accounts, and they consist of basically two types of accounts. You have the standard user accounts, and those have a limited set of privileges. They are given the privilege to do their job. Normally you have access to the internet. You can go and have access to some applications and then some resources, and that's usually defined by role-based access. And then of course you have your guest users, right? They have a lot fewer accounts, a lot fewer access, and that's normally limited to just basically internet and some of the applications that they need. It's when you get to the privileged accounts, as you mentioned, that you really start having an issue. Because a privileged account is any account that actually gives that privilege beyond those non-privileged accounts, right? And it's because of those elevated capabilities and access that those privileged users or privileged accounts give you that great risk. And it's a lot larger risk than those non-privileged accounts. Now, when you come to standing privileges, those are basically privileges that are essentially always on. So you have a privileged account and you have those standing privileges, they're on every machine and they're always on, whether you need that access today, currently, or ever. And those standing privileges are really the polar opposite to the principle of least privilege, or zero trust access, as you mentioned. And zero trust access was something, and I'll go into later, that was coined by Gartner. And it's one of the core philosophies that argues that users should have access only to the resources they need at the time they need it. A perfect example, I think, is if you look at a hotel and you look at a maintenance worker, they have a key card, and they have that key card that can be used on any room at any time. So if they are malicious or they lose that card and someone else grabs it, they have that access again to any room at any time. So being able to limit that really helps you in an organization. And I think that's probably one of the good examples. So as I mentioned, standing privileges create that excessive access, right? So if you grab those credentials or they're compromised, it's basically like that maintenance worker in the hotel. And it's really incumbent to organizations to reduce that attack surface. If you can reduce that attack surface, then you can reduce the risk of data breaches. And most companies should make it a priority to really reduce the number of accounts that have that standing privileges and move towards that standing zero privilege model. So why is this important and who's vulnerable? These are all public breaches, and they're all breaches that have been able to be accomplished because of the fact that they use elevated privileges and then they move laterally, as you initially mentioned. Right? In the case of Marriott, this was a database breach, and they found out that this was breached using administrator credentials. But when they did further investigation, they found out that the person using that wasn't the person who those credentials were assigned to. They also found out that there were tools put on there, for instance, a remote access, a remote Trojan tool, and a tool called Mimikatz. Mimikatz is basically, if you're not familiar with it, a tool that allows you to sniff usernames and passwords and also be able to use attacks such as pass the hash and other things. Robinhood, similar type of scenario, that was just a simple social engineering attack. A user was convinced to give their credentials to somebody, and they were able to use those credentials and move throughout the system. And SolarWinds, they used malware, which is a raindrop malware. And that also used other tools such as PowerShell. And it's being able to control that access and control the administrator rights to those machines that would have prevented all of these and many others. You know, and unfortunately, we're all too familiar with what's going on right now with Russia and Ukraine. But prior to them even attacking, they also had their cyberware and their attacks going on, right? And in this instance, they went in and they used disk wiping attacks to try to wipe out all the information that Ukraine had. And the method of attacks, again, were privilege escalation, right? They use command and scripting techniques, and it maps to the MITRE framework, and I'll go into that as well. But being able to even use those PowerShell commands to do any future damage or to run anything could have all been prevented had there not been that administrative account or an account that was able to do that with privilege escalation on those machines to start with. So to your point originally, whether it's ransomware or any other type of account, you know, attack, vulnerability or something else, which again, I'll show, this can all be prevented if you go to a zero standing privilege model type. And if you can get to that model type, you can prevent a lot of these breaches and a lot of attacks. So what I normally do is map these up against two frameworks. There's the Lockheed Martin kill chain, and there's the MITRE attack framework. So if you look at how attacks take place, and I'll look at the Lockheed Martin one to start with. So the Lockheed Martin, if you're not familiar with it, the cyber kill chain is a model for the identification and prevention of intrusions. It really identifies how the adversaries move through the network from their start to the end. So if you look at the left-hand side, it always starts with reconnaissance. And on the right-hand side, it always starts with their goal, which either is denial of service or exfiltration. So being able to prevent something along this path stops these, I'll say, intrusions, breaches, hacks, whatever you want to call it, in its place. So in these models, and you'll see all of them, if you have a zero standing privilege implemented policy, you don't have access to those admin accounts, and you're able to block in its track the hacking. You're able to block in its tracks the malware and the ransomware because it's unable to escalate and proliferate throughout your environment. The same holds true for, as you mentioned, Adrian, up front, right? The phishing, the social engineering attacks, being able to prevent that link that you've clicked on, or being able to prevent the proliferation of these attacks can all be prevented by implementing a zero standing privilege model. Because without those elevations, you're not able to do things on that endpoint and then move laterally throughout the organization. Even if I was able to get on that one system, it's limited to that one system. And it's limited to that one system only for the amount of time that that person has access. So you have limited your blast zone to that one machine, that one server, that one workstation. The same holds true for vulnerabilities. We see these all day long. We don't know about them, that there are 0 days as well. But again, it's very hard to gain a foothold and be able to actually use these attacks if you go to the zero standing privilege implementation. So what's my point? My point is we should all be moving towards a zero standing privilege model, whether you're using the Lockheed Martin kill chain and looking for reconnaissance to exfiltration or denial of service, or you look at the factors from the MITRE attack framework. And again, if you're not familiar with the MITRE attack framework, this actually takes things that have been seen in the wild, and then they try to match up the indicators of compromise to protect everybody moving forward from what happened, to show the techniques, tactics, and procedures that are being used so that you can prevent them. And with this framework as well, going to that zero standing privilege model will disallow that privilege escalation, will disallow those credential access, and prevent that lateral movement. We know this because we see all these attacks that take place in the wild. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the attacks and how they work. So passing the hash has been around as long as Windows has been around. Basically, if you pass the hash, you're taking someone's stolen credentials and you're taking those hashes to move laterally through an environment. If you use pass the hash, you're authenticating the user without having access to those users' clear text passwords. So you don't need to have a password at all. You're able to take that hash in memory and then use that for an attack. Mimikatz, as I mentioned, is a tool. It was found in Marriott. It was found in many attacks that we see. And this is an open source platform. So anybody can grab this. And if you have administrative privileges on that machine, you can run this as a standalone tool. It even has a PowerShell module, and that can enumerate Kerberos tickets and be able to use those tickets to gain a foothold in your environment without even having to again, know the passwords or have somebody logged in at the time. Credential harvesting, used many times. Malicious individuals can use this information on the dark web, right? They can use it on Pastebin or many other sites and be able to find that information. So if I'm able to get your username and password, I can use that to attack your system. If that username and password is a standard user, does not have privileges, then at that point, again, you pretty much lock them down to that one system. There's not much they can do with it. The same with phishing, as I mentioned, right? It's a social engineering attack. It's going after your credit card information, your logins. It's all social engineering, but limiting your permissions, going to that zero standing privilege model will prevent those attacks. And again, password spray attacks, right? That could be a brute force attack. That could be just being able to find common passwords that servers use. When you install something as a service account and you don't change that username password, they're going to try that. And this is where they normally use that reconnaissance that we saw up front on the Lockheed Martin model, where you're going in and you're really taking a lot of time to find out where you want to go because you don't want to get locked out. You don't want people to know that you're doing that. And it's because of all the steps leading up to this that we have a dwell time of 6 months, right? It's because of the time that they can sit there on the account with those privileges and do things that they don't get caught. So being able to go to that zero trust model is very, very important. So don't take my word for it, right? As I mentioned, Gartner coined the phrase zero trust and zero standing privileges. So when they talk about going to that zero standing privilege and that zero trust model, there's a couple of principles. Basically, the first principle is that someone or something should have the exact minimum rights required to carry out a specific task. The problem is, and we all know this, is that a lot of organizations start from a point where certain rights have certain users right off the bat, and they have that privileged access to start with. So there's no limitation on it, and that violates right off the bat the privilege of least access. Also, rather than limiting the time when a privileged user has access or that user is granted, which is called at the right time or just-in-time access, that access is granted on a standing basis, which means it's always on and always available. And also, rather than limiting the amount of required permissions for that particular task, privileged accounts also have broad administrative privileges, right? Whether you're using a super user, domain admin, local admin, or the equivalent. And that's really to cover all the possible administrative tasks that you need now or in the future, right? So someone comes in your organization and you say, hey, John has, or Adrian has these rights. This person is going to be doing the same role as him. Let's just put him in that group. The problem with that is Adrian may have been there for 10 years. He might have had other roles. He probably has more permission than he needs to start with as well. So just by doing that, you're actually giving him more right than is needed to any system. So that's pretty much where you're talking about how to protect the organization, how to get yourself down into a zero standing privilege account using just-in-time access, using the access for the amount of time that's needed to do your role, and that's it. So people do try to protect themselves, right? What we see in the industry is that people are using legacy PAM solutions. Now that focuses on the visibility and control of your existing privilege accounts and activities. At the same time, though, it leaves the privilege elevation and the delegation approaches either non-existent or immature. It doesn't look for any standing privileges that currently exist throughout your organization. It also gives many privileges and many accounts that are interactive, fully armed access. It gives them the unnecessary level that I just talked about those high level standing privileges. And that also violates the privilege and least privileges and just-in-time access. So although many organizations use a PAM solution, it's basically more for vaulting and taking privilege access passwords and just encapsulating them. And it makes it a little more complex, but it's complexity just to be more complex. It really doesn't give you the advantages that you need. And lastly, what we see out there is the fact that many organizations struggle to introduce that change. So the administrators, the IT operators, the people who are used to having this personal privileges account, they use it at their discretion. Being able to now whittle that back and take away those permissions normally ends up in a little bit of a fight. So we've talked about the zero standing privileges. We've talked about how people are trying to protect it. Let's just talk about how it exists in its purest form and the model that you really want to try to get to prevent the breaches, to put yourself in the best position that if anything happens, at least it's contained to a simple system and cannot move laterally. So standing zero privileges in its purest form, just in time, addresses being able to only at the right time, and it addresses removing those standing privileges. And standing privileges take many forms, right? It can be continuous privileges in the form of privilege group. It could be static rules. It could be service accounts, but all of those allow for the execution of privilege commands. A common example, one that we normally see that violates that is, as I mentioned, those privilege accounts, right? Those are accounts that are routinely issued within an organization. They're issued to administrators, they're issued to those IT operators, and they normally hold excessive privileges more than they need to do their job. And even when it's controlled by a PAM tool, the account and therefore the privileges exist, leaving those standing privileges in the environment. So the first goal of a just-in-time approach is better IT security by removing those standing privileges. If you remove the standing privileges, you will reduce the attack surface for that privilege abuse. The first step for legacy PAM is to discover and vault those privileged accounts. But as I mentioned, even if you identify all those accounts, the accounts still tend to have static privileges attached to them, which means they're fully armed, and they're armed almost at any time. So the journey that you should be taking as an industry is advanced identity access management, right? So it really is the elimination of the personal, highly privileged accounts, as well as all of the other privileged accounts that grants that wide-reaching, always-on access. So I do have a little video here. Again, it's just a high overview of how standing privileges work and how easy it is to move from one environment to the other. I hope I shared it correctly and you guys can actually hear the audio on it. Today, I just want to talk a little bit about standing access and standing privilege access. It's standing privilege access that really leads to lateral movement. If you can stop that privilege access that's on a machine, you can pretty much stop lateral movement. So what you'll notice is here on the machine on the left, it is Windows 10.3 machine, and I'm just looking at who's in the administrators group. The people in the administrators group local to this machine have standing privilege access. They have too much access that's actually needed to do the job. This access should only be granted when they need to do the job, and that's called just-in-time access. So if you look at the machine on the right, again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm showing you that the user on there is Jane. You're going to see that she is a member of the administrators group as well with others. And that is what is going to lead to that excessive access or standing privilege access. This is what's being used currently in the wild from Russia attacking countries. They used it to attack Ukraine with a wiper malware. Semantic Threat Hunting Group wrote up a good article about that, so definitely take a look at that. And there are other articles as well. So what you can see here is that on the left-hand side, I have the administrators group. On the right-hand side, I have the administrators group. There are people in there, so that is standing privilege access. Now, even if I had something in place to give access to those machines, such as a PAM, Privileged Access Manager, with a vault, there's nothing that it's going to do to prevent these standing privileges on it, right? So as you can see here, I'm enumerating from Windows 10 on the left to Windows 2 on the right, and you can see that Mimikatz is there. So because Mimikatz tool exists on that machine, I am able to remotely run that and move laterally from the machine on the left to the machine on the right, simply because there is this concept of standing privilege access. So to prevent something like this happening, you really want to remove that standing privilege access. I'm just simply running the command in PowerShell, which again is what Russia used against Ukraine. You can see that Mimikatz is running on the right-hand side. Once I stop this, you're going to see that it stops running and you no longer see it in the task manager. This is a simple example, but it shows the power of being able to use an excess account that is located on a machine. So in order to be able to eliminate this standing privileges and eliminate lateral movement, you're going to have to remove the standing privilege access. So I've removed it now on the machine on the right, which is the Windows 2 box. And what you're going to be able to see when I run those same commands, even trying to get just the host name, it's not going to be able to get that. Again, Jane is still administrator on that machine on the left, but on the machine on the right, Jane is no longer administrator. We've removed those standing privileged access accounts. All right, so let's try to go ahead and run a script from one machine to another, and that would be running it laterally, and you're going to see that it's going to fail. So again, just showing you that Mimikatz is still there. I'm going to first try to get the host name of that Win10.2 machine, and you can see that its access is denied because I don't have privileges. When I try to run Mimikatz, it's going to do the same thing. It's not going to run, and you're not going to see it running on that machine. And again, access is denied. So by removing that concept of privilege access, and in this case, standing privilege access, you all but stop the ability to do lateral movement, and you close that vector, which is open to so many hacks. I hope this has been informative. Thank you very much. And that pretty much, Adrian, concludes the portion that I want to talk about how to prevent lateral movement, how to remove the standing privilege access, and why organizations really need to move to that zero standing privilege model in order to be able to protect themselves from the majority of attacks out there in the wild.
Thank you, David. And I was completely wrong. It wasn't boring at all. I have to say it's very interesting. So thank you. We have Mike. There's a question in the Q&A. Shall we just go ahead and?
Yeah, please do, if you can see that.
Yeah. So Theron has asked, and I think it's, if I could ask you to help me out with this one, David, really, how do you implement ZSP, so zero standing privilege, in a complex organization with more than 4,000 plus employees and contractors, which is a reasonably, I think a lot of people are going to be in that position, right? They've got environments that have grown up over a long time, grown organically, lots of things have come and gone. And so unpicking all that and implementing again, kind of from scratch with an entirely new identity approach seems like it could be really painful. What's your experience, David?
Yeah, so It is always painful, right? Making that change is painful, but we can make it less painful. So the first step is discovery, being able to find out where those standing privileges exist is the first step. Once you find that, then you can start moving through the model of removing that access. What I find is normally you want to start with the low-hanging fruit. So you want to start removing the local administrators' accounts, and you want to remove people who are in that account because nobody really needs that type of access as a standing privilege account. Then once you do that, you can start working on the other groups and do it in a systematic process where over time you're moving towards that model. So it's not a line in the sand or we're going to move everybody over today, but it's starting with the people who have the greatest privilege, starting to remove that, and then weeding your way down to the, I won't say the lower hanging fruit, but the ones who are less vulnerable or cause the least amount of damage in the organization. It's definitely something that takes time, and it's definitely a move towards something and getting towards that model.
So would you, that sounds like you'd recommend starting with, you know, identifying your sysadmins and those kind of people that have need to regularly have privileged access.
The always on access, the standing privilege would be the first place to start, correct?
Yeah, okay. Which I guess it can be a little bit scary because that tends to be, yeah, kind of messing with the people that drive the organization, right? And it's, yeah, you don't want to get that wrong, I guess, but it's, yeah, it seems like a sensible place to start. And you're right, we see local admin actually, local admin accounts, permanent local admin accounts, particularly on laptops these days, involved in a lot of breaches.
Yeah, I mean, step one would be, you know what, take that line in the sand and stop anyone else from being able to add access. So rather than eliminating the access you have, step one is discovering the access, stopping anyone else from being able to grant more access, and then be able at least to start from there. Because as you mentioned, right, especially Windows, when you bring up a system, guess what? You have local admin access. As soon as you have a domain administrator, by default, they're put in that admins group, right? So it makes it tough just by the nature of doing business. And that's where you have to start.
And I think the bad guys also know that on the back of a crisis is always good business, right? So we saw a huge amount of hasty implementations at the start of lockdown. That, you know, companies that weren't used to or didn't have a work from home model, you know, is the typical one, and laptops were built and configured and rolled out very, very fast. And you know, maybe people didn't have the time to think about, you know, okay, what is the best way to do this, or what is the standard we're going to apply? They just had to get them out to get the business running, right? And I think, you know, we're now seeing some of that coming back to haunt us a little bit, and we're sort of revising. We're going back with some customers now and say, okay, yeah, now let's look at it. But I guess some of that will never get fixed, right? And the bad guys know that. It's just the way it is.
Exactly. We're going to go on a question, but I've got one for you, Dave, before that. So we talked about e-discovery, but are you also an advocate that this isn't a one-off exercise, that we need to repeat this from time to time because configurations change? You know, we set up privileged access to find a fault or do something, and then we forget to, you know, switch it back off again. So do you advocate that, you know, really we should repeat this on a, you know, a fairly sort of regular basis?
Yeah, so once it's set up correctly, and if you have the correct tools in place, that becomes less of an issue because it should remediate it automatically. But you're absolutely correct. With any compliance or looking at anything, it's a snapshot in time. So you always want to be diligent. You always want to have a circular approach where you're going back and validating it, fixing it, validating it. And you're absolutely correct. That is the right approach.
Yeah. I wish I had £1 or $1 for every time I've been told, oh yes, we've done all this, we've done this e-discovery, yeah, but when did you do it? Oh, about 5 years ago. And have you repeated it? Oh no. Do you think you should?
Exactly.
So we got a question from Gordy, so which is, should we be considering ex-employee accounts to be deleted first?
So that is definitely a good place to start. The one thing to be weary of is making sure that those employees don't have service accounts. Things that are running aren't set up in their name. Because if you automatically just go through and delete them without first discovering and doing everything else, you do have the ability to shut down services which you need. So it really is, again, discovery first, seeing who has those privileges, and then being able to remove them. At that point, yes, definitely go with the ex-employees, but I would not just, chop them off at the knees, because you don't know what access they have without that discovery.
Disable first, then remove.
Yeah. And I once had a customer years ago actually who had 1,200 employees and 30,000 accounts, and they'd never deleted anything, right? So, but for what at the time seemed like good reasons. It's just the way things were.
And the other one to look out for is that people on long-term sick. Is that again, through good old social media, the bad guys find out that somebody's off sick, and is their account still live?
Yeah,
and quite often, yes, it is.
Yeah. But going towards that zero standing privilege model limits that attack surface. So if you're subject to social engineering, or everybody puts on, social media, I'm away, I'm on vacation, I'm doing this, about that. If I was able to compromise your account, the blast zone is so minimal with a zero standing privilege access model that it's not as big a concern as it is today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think with a lot of these things, there's a lot of work to get it set up and configured first time. But once you've done it, once you've got through that hard work, it then makes life a lot easier. But I think a lot of organizations find it difficult to invest that time up front, and they're always sort of firefighting. But if they did take that step back and get this sorted, life will be a lot easier for them.
Do you get resistance though, David, from like the sysadmins on that point? Do you find there's resistance to this kind of change? Because it's perceived as a thing which stops them just SSHing into a thing and they're away, or whatever it is. Is it?
Again, before David answers that, I've got another one. Again, I wish I had £1 or $1 for every time being told, "You're going to stop me from doing my job."
And that's the answer, right? You're going to stop me from doing my job. Change is never easy. Nobody likes it. I'll be the first to admit, I'll go kicking and screaming every day of the week when you tell me there's change, and I haven't even looked to see what the change is. It's just, we don't like change. It affects how we do our job, and change is normally good, but yes, we have to have a different approach on change.
Okay.
So I just pick up that GDPR.
I was going to say, we've got somebody who doesn't want to give us their personal details, but
that's very GDPR compliant.
Exactly.
So I'll try and answer that one, because I don't think it's fair to try and get our American colleague to answer it. But, so what do you keep of accounts for purposes of GDPR? So the answer is, in my experience, it varies depending on the industry that the customer is in. So what kind of data the ex users are storing, or even current users are processing and storing. And typically, though, we would see the data kept rather than the account. So I guess there's two things there. There's the employee details, which there'll be in most cases an HR system somewhere where that stuff is kept for a period of time, and then there's the data they stored and processed on behalf of the employer. And if that has got PII in it or anything else which comes under the jurisdiction of GDPR, then that is stored for a period of time. But the actual account credentials and all the permissions they use to do that can all be got rid of in a sort of IT operational standard way, really.
I think it comes down to also there's an argument that any personal related data should be in core systems, not in personal file store. But I think we all know that people do put things on the C drive and what have you. So it's therefore then moving it into more of a corporate file store than a personal file store, and get rid of it.
Yeah, ideally, yeah.
Okay, and we've got another question. So if you implement a ZSP model, should there be a mechanism to determine when a new access request should be granted, and for how long, or even if this is really needed, and who would be responsible for that would it be line managers, IT, etc.?
So it's a great question. And I think I'm going to give you my standard, it depends. So every organization is going to have different ways of doing things, but you always, when it comes to zero standing privileges and the amount of time, look at how long it typically takes to do a role, give it for that amount of time. The time can always be extended. So if you need more time, by all means, extend the time. But I would be very leery about giving too much time to start with, because it's harder to take it away than it is to add it.
So
but is there a, sorry.
You set it up then with that sort of time limits. So you got a time limit, so they'll be cut off. And if you have to then give them more time, then give them more time.
Yeah, and there are two reasons, right? If I know that doing a server patch is going to take 4 hours, and that's the time I give, and somebody else is requesting access for another couple of hours, there are two things. A, what are they doing with the other two hours, right? Everybody else can do the job in 4 hours. Or B, are they trying to do something that they shouldn't be doing? So
yeah.
And who, just the thing I sort of picked up from that question. So in terms of the workflow, so we're talking about, ideally an automated system where somebody requests access to the thing, and then there's a system owner who grants or denies access, right, for that period of time, I guess. But I mean, in that workflow, and it's an interesting question, who is the person who grants or denies access to that system? Is it IT, or is it a manager who owns that data? Do you see what I mean? Or is it both? I mean, who gives access?
So that again is a depends answer. Who would normally grant access? Who is the one that approves that this user should be on that system for the time? Whether it's a store, a ticketing system, or wherever it has, there should be an approver. You should be able to approve it on behalf of somebody, but who grants that access is totally up to that organization.
Company to company. Yeah. I mean, my personal view is I think there always needs to be an owner who needs to be involved with. I mean, day-to-day IT stuff, fine. You can have kind of a change process that covers that. But I think for administrative access to data, privileged access to data, sorry, you need the data owner to make that decision. Whether that's delegated to someone else or not, is kind of up to you as an organization, like David says. But someone is responsible for that application or that data, and I think they need to know who they're granting privileged access to, which they probably don't at the moment, right? In any case.
And that's where you get that privileged access sprawl, is that I don't know who should be granting access. I don't know the exact access they need. Somebody needs to do the job today. You know what? I'm just going to put them in this group. And it either gives them too much access to everything, it never gets removed. You move on to your next job and you forget about it, right? So having that approval status, having that zero standing privilege with the just-in-time access eliminates that need, which we see every day in organizations.
We always find, it's very interesting if you do an audit of this, you always find, or without fail so far, we've always found there is a big discrepancy, or a discrepancy, sometimes big, sometimes small, between the number of domain admins that the company thinks they have and the number that they actually have when you go and pull all the information together, right? And that's, that to me translates to there are people in the business who own data who don't know who has access to that data, right? If you're a domain admin, you can do whatever you want, right? And
so I was having that conversation yesterday, funny enough, and somebody said, well, we heard that you should only have 2 domain admins, which I thought was a low number. But there's a balance. Having too much access or too many people with that credential is bad. Not having enough is going to give you that same problem, because if I need that access and there's only 2 people who have it, you end up with that shared account and shared password. You're going to end up giving that to somebody because it makes your job easier.
Yeah, everyone knows. Everyone knows David's password suddenly, right? Because you don't want to, exactly, you don't want to do everything 24 hours a day. So you're right, it generates another problem.
And I think you've said it a few times there, David. It depends, and it depends on sort of business needs, and you've got to have that balance of flexibility that you can resolve issues when they occur, but also having that security protection.
Correct. The job of business is business, and it's there to make money. And it is getting better. As a security practitioner, you need to be flexible. You need to find the way to do things where the business continue to do business. And that's why I love this zero standing privilege with just-in-time access, because you don't have to monitor it. The person has the ability to do the job when they need it, and it gets removed on a timely basis.
Yeah, and it can form part of workflow and part of incident management. And you know, the incident manager can approve. You can build the workflow however you want, right? So the incident manager can, or from a big incident, however you run it, can approve somebody having a certain level of access for a certain time to fix a problem, right? And then revoke it afterwards.
And I think we've all been in the position where, you know, again, when I was on the financial side, every year we had our PCI audits. And no matter what we did, what solutions we put in place, they would be able to pass the hash. They would be able to grant the golden ticket. They would be able to do something and compromise us. And it always goes back to excessive privileges, right? And that's why, yes, it might be boring to some, but it's dear to my heart that if you don't have those privileges, you don't get bit in the butt when you have these audits, and you don't get bit when you get hacked or ransomware. It's just, it's not as difficult as it was to implement anymore. And it saves you so much time and effort and angst at the end.
Mm-hmm. And again, it should be put on the, well, you know, it's just a sensible thing to do, but why do organizations make it so complex and it's too difficult to do? We'll live with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, you know, it's not like David said, it's not easy to implement, right? It's like everything else. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of planning. Yeah. But again, like everything else, it can be done in stages. And I guess we have this group of people that's the ideal target for starting with, you know, those guys that have permanent privilege access.
It takes time and energy, and therefore cost, but yeah. What is the cost of not doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, David, if it's how embedded, I don't know, in America in particular, I don't know how embedded privileged access management is into regulatory or compliance at the moment, or is it not something that's mandated?
So it is a checkbox, but as with everything else, at some point that checkbox becomes irrelevant, or as I call it, legacy, because people have been able to find vulnerabilities in those vaults. People have been able to bypass it because, as I mentioned, the vaults don't really address standing privileges. So the bad threat actors, the malicious people in your organization are looking for ways to get around that. And by removing that privilege, you're removing their access and ability to do that. So yes, while it's a checkbox, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be protected. Let's look at all the breaches that I just mentioned. We'll go to Bridgestone, which the supply chains were just hacked and it stopped their business. Again, they have all been the best of breed solutions. They all thought they were protected, but at the end we see they weren't. Mm. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it's not easy, but by removing that access, you remove that threat vector.
I think that's an excellent point you make there, David. It's not a one-off exercise. You put this in place, you up your protection, but we can't stand still because the bad guys are involving their attacks all the time, and we've got to keep pace with that.
Agreed.
Couple more questions I see there, Mike. So zero standing privilege can even start from disabling USB ports and working from there up. Yeah, I mean, absolutely good practice, right? I guess you could say, yeah, local access to USB ports is an example of excessive privilege in some cases, right? Maybe sometimes in all cases. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then what's your pick between 2FA and ZSP? Both.
Yep.
Yeah, I think they complement each other perfectly, don't they? Is it? Do you typically implement with multi-factor authentication as well, David? Do you see that a lot?
So multi-factor authentication is basically that. It's authentication. It's allowing you in. So another good example is a safe deposit box. You go into the bank, you say, I have my key, I want to get to my safe deposit box. The bank officer walks you in there and leaves you in that room. That's MFA. You're allowed in that room. Now, are you authorized to look at every single box? No. You should only be able to look at the box that you have your key for. So there's a huge difference. And just because you're using some sort of multi-factor authentication doesn't stop that authorization, doesn't stop the breaches that we've talked about, being able to take those privileges and move laterally. Definitely a good step, but not the end step.
So with a combined approach is the best way.
Security in depth is always the best way.